I'll be reading Matthew 24:42 to 25:30. The Bible says, "Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, 'My master is not coming for a long time,' and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour which he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the kingdom of heaven will be compared to 10 virgins, who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were prudent. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the prudent took oil in flask along with their lamps. Now while the bridegroom was delaying, they all got drowsy and began to sleep. But at midnight there was a shout, 'Behold the bridegroom! Come out and meet him.' Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the prudent, 'Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out.' But the prudent answered, 'No, there will not be enough for us and you too. Go instead to the dealers and buy some for yourselves.' And while they were going away to make the purchase, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding feast, and the door was shut. Later the other virgins also came, saying, 'Lord, Lord, open up for us.' But he answered, 'Truly I say to you, I do not know you. Be on the alert then, for you do not know the day nor the hour. For it is just like a man about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. And he went on his journey. Immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them, and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner, the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who received that 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received the 5 talents came up and bought 5 more talents, saying, 'Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful slave. You are faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' Also, the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, 'Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I have gained 2 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' And the one who had also received the 1 talent came up and said, 'Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid, and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours.' But his master answered and said to him, 'You wicked, lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money at the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. Therefore, take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. Throw out the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.'"
Let me ask, have any of you ever read Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? Anybody read that book? In this book, Stephen Covey essentially talks about how to be a successful person, how to be successful in life, and he gives you these 7 habits on how to do that. And if you've read that book, then you're probably familiar with the phrase, begin with the end in mind, because that's one of the habits that he espouses. He says, successful people begin with the end in mind. Now, some of you probably already know what this means, but the idea behind beginning with the end in mind is we need to be on the road that leads to our destination, right? If we have a goal, then our actions need to be oriented around that goal. That's sort of the idea behind begin with the end in mind. And let me just give you a couple of examples on that. If there's someone who wants to be a doctor, someone who wants to grow up and be a doctor, well, then what do they need to do? Well, they need to do the things that set them up for being a doctor, right? That means that they go to school, get a good education, do well in school, get a degree in something pre-med, and then go to medical school, and just do all of those things if that's their goal, if that is their destination. If someone wants to have a certain amount of money saved up for retirement, well, then what do they need to do? Well, they need to do things that sets them up for that goal. That means they save a certain amount of money. That means they invest. They do those things. And that's sort of the idea with begin with the end in mind. We need to be walking on the road that leads to our destination. And our society gets this. Right? This is a big part of our culture. That's why kids go to school, and that's why parents want their kids to do well in school. Right? Our parents say, well, you guys go to school and make good grades. Work hard. Why? Well, because we want our kids to be successful in life, right? We want them to be successful. We want them to be able to provide for themselves. We're trying to set them up for the goal, for the destination. And that's why people save up for retirement too. So this is something that our culture gets. This is something that our society gets. And we even get this in religious cultures, right? As Christians, we understand this statement. We begin or we live with the end in mind. Because as Christians, we all have a goal, don't we? We all have a destination that we're trying to reach. We want to be with God for eternity. The goal is a pretty big deal when it comes to Christianity. And that's why I think there are always these new predictions about when the Lord is going to come back. I mean, I haven't heard any here in the last couple of years, but there tend to pop up these new predictions. The end of the world is going to be on this date and this hour. Now, we know that no one knows when the Lord is coming back. The Scripture is very clear about that, and what Scott read made that clear. No one knows when the Lord is going to come back, but we still need to live with the end in mind. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. If you notice the three parables that Scott read, this was sort of the idea behind them. It's getting people ready for the end. Scott read the parable of the wise and foolish servants at the end of chapter 24. He read the parable of the 10 bridesmaids or the 10 virgins. And he read the parable of the talents. And all of these parables sort of revolve around this idea of being ready for the end. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about some things that we need to understand if we're going to live with the end in mind. So are you guys ready to study some scripture tonight? Let's do it. All right, so what do we need to understand if we're going to live with the end in mind? One thing that we need to understand is that we have a master. Now, this is something that's evident in all of the parables that we have read. In all the parables that Scott read, there was a master, and this master had expectations for his servant, for his slave, however the translations translate that. And there were servants, and the servants needed to meet the expectations of the master. For instance, in the parable of the wise and foolish servant, the master leaves, and he leaves the servant in charge. This servant has some temporary authority, but he's not the master. The master is the one with true power and true authority, but the master leaves and gives the servant some temporary authority. And when the master comes back, well, the servant is going to have to answer to the master for the way that he lived his life. And that's what we see in that parable. There's a master, and there are servants. In the parable of the 10 virgins, that's also what we see. We typically don't think of it like that. We see a groom and bridesmaids, but really undergirding this parable is there's a master and there are servants. That's why in the parable when the foolish virgins, they knock at the door, let us in, let us in. And what does he say? He says, oh, I do not know you. I'm not going to let you in. Why is he able to say that? Because he is the master. So even in that parable, there's a master and there are servants. And in the parable of the talents, there is a master and there are servants. The master gives each servant a particular amount of money, and the master has some expectations for the servants. And the servants need to meet those expectations because when the master returns, when the master comes back, he will ultimately judge them based on how they lived, based on what they did with the possessions. So in each of these examples, we see a master who has expectations, and we see servants who need to meet those expectations. And that's really the lesson for us, because I think that's one of the things that this parable is trying to teach us, that we have a master. And, obviously that's true of us as Christians, but what does that mean? The fact that we have a master. What does that mean for us? Well, that means that life isn't about us. Life isn't about me. Life isn't about you. Life is about the master. This servant at the end of Matthew chapter 24, the foolish servant, he didn't quite understand this. Let's start reading again from verse 48. It says, "But if that wicked servant," chapter 24 and verse 48, "if that wicked servant says to himself, 'My master is delayed,' and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him into pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." In the parable of the wise and foolish servant, this foolish servant, for him, it was all about self. It was all about him and what he wanted, because the master had some expectations for that servant. The master wanted the servant to do some things, to feed the other servants, but he didn't want to do that. He wanted to do what he wanted to do. He says, I'm going to eat and drink with the drunkards. I'm going to eat and drink with those guys over there, and I'm going to beat the other servants. I want to do what I want to do. See, for this foolish servant, it wasn't about the master at all. It was about him and living life his way. Well, let me just say that that's our culture. That's the culture that we live in. In our culture, it's all about me. It's all about us. And we live in America. What's America known for? Freedom, right? We can live how we want. I can do what I want to do. As a matter of fact, it seems like, at least in our culture, that it's looked down upon if you try and give people advice, if you try and give them advice on how to live their lives. Well, then you're judging. Don't tell me how to live my life. I want to live my life how I want to. I want to do what I want to do. And that's just sort of permeated throughout our culture. You walk into like a convenience store or something like that, and the customer is always right. What can we do for you? You walk into a restaurant, the customer is always right. What can we do for you? Have it your way, right? And we've even brought that into the religious realm today, because there are people who will walk into a church building and they will look at a church and they'll say, well, what can you do for me? What can God do for me? Rather than saying, what can I do for the kingdom? How can I serve with you guys? See, our culture, it seems like it's all about us. And what we really need to learn is that we do have a master, and it's not all about us. It's about him. Let's go to the book of John really quick. John chapter 6. John chapter 6, in this context, this is when Jesus feeds the 5,000. I want to look at verse 15, sort of the people's response to him feeding, to this miracle, to him feeding all of these people. John chapter 6 and verse 15, it says, "Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself." So what did these Jews want from Jesus? Right, they wanted to make him king. And this is not something that's sort of uncommon in the Old Testament. We see that the ancient Jews, the disciples of Jesus, they expected him to be this king. I think of the triumphal entry where these people want to make Jesus king. And we typically look at that sort of through modern eyes. We look at that, at these disciples of Jesus wanting to make him king, and we kind of shake our heads, we wag our fingers, and we say, you see, they just didn't understand. They just didn't quite get it. Now, Jesus, he wasn't going to be this earthly king. We think we get it better than they do. But let me just say, there are some things I believe that they understood better than we do. I believe if Paul were here today, he would say, in some sense, you guys don't get it. Because the disciples were right. Jesus is king. And Jesus does have a kingdom. It's just not like a small kingdom. He's not king of the Jews. He's not king of Israel. They were wrong in scope, but they had the right idea. Jesus isn't king of a nation. He's king of everything. You see, they were just thinking too small. But really, the Jews had the right idea. And that's something that we have got to understand. Jesus is king. And that means it's about him. That's something, we don't have kings today, so we don't understand the implications of that. But that means it's about him. We serve him. We are the servant. If we're going to live with the end in mind, then that's something we need to remember. We need to remember that we have a master. But that's not all that we need to remember. If we're going to live with the end in mind, then we also must be all in. What I mean by that is we must be willing to sacrifice our all, the entirety of our lives. We've got to be truly dedicated to the Lord. And we can't be apathetic. Whenever I look at these three parables that we've read, it seems like the foolish servants in each of these parables, they weren't truly all in. They were kind of apathetic. Some of them did just enough to get by. I know you teachers know what I'm talking about. The student who may be very smart, but they do just enough to get by, don't really care about class. They're not really all in. They're not truly dedicated. They're not willing to give it their all. Well, that's how some of these foolish servants were. They weren't really all in. And that's obvious in the first parable that we read, right? The master leaves, and the foolish servant, he doesn't want to do the master's will. He wants to do his own will. And it seems like he just wanted to be a servant in name only, right? He wanted to be able to call himself a servant, but he didn't want to do the things that would actually make him a servant. And I think that's the whole idea. Whenever he says, well, my master is going to be delayed, so I can sort of do what I want now and then fix it before he comes back. He wanted to be a servant in name only. And we see something similar with the foolish virgins, that they weren't truly dedicated. They weren't ready to give it their all. The fact that they didn't bring any oil for their lamps, that really shows their apathy, their lack of dedication. As a matter of fact, the fact that they didn't bring any oil is sort of inexcusable in that time. You know, some people like to make excuses for the five virgins who didn't bring any oil, and they'll say, well, the groom was delayed, right? The groom was running late. Maybe if the groom was on time, then it would have been okay. And whenever people say that, they're really looking at it through our eyes, because in our culture, time is very important. And in our culture, punctuality is very important. I mean, that's why we have clocks on almost everything now, phones, computers, whatever it may be. And these clocks are always synced. I don't know, like, who changes their time anymore? I'd never have to change my car. It's the time changed on my car on its own. And so, like, all of our clocks are synced. And why is that? Well, because time is important to us. Punctuality is important to us. In our culture, if you're late, well, they're going to start without you, right? If you're late to services start at what time? Services start at 5, and if you're not here, we're gonna get started, right? We're not waiting. No, that's because punctuality is important in our time. In their time, punctuality was less important because they didn't have all the clocks that were synchronized and everything. They kind of just, they looked at the sun to sort of get the time. And I was reading one book that said when in the ancient times when people would worship, and I know some of you guys would love this, and the other half would not like this at all. But in the ancient times, whenever they worshiped, they actually wouldn't start worship until the last person arrived. Yeah, exactly. They wouldn't start worship until the last person arrived because, they just didn't have a really super accurate way to tell time. And so looking at this parable of the groom, well, it was kind of normal for grooms to be running late. That wasn't abnormal at all. So these bridesmaids, well, they should have known. They should have brought oil with them. And from what we know about these lamps or these torches, the text says they didn't have any oil whatsoever. And from what we know about these lamps without oil, they don't burn for very long at all, maybe a couple of minutes, and they don't burn very brightly either. So the fact that these bridesmaids, these 5 virgins, didn't bring any oil, that's just inexcusable. They weren't giving their all, they weren't giving their best to the master. Rather, they were apathetic. See, they weren't all in, they weren't dedicated. And looking at the last parable that we read, the parable of the talents, the 1-talent man, he wasn't all in either. The master had given him a temporary authority. The master had blessed him with this possession, and the master said, I'm giving this blessing to you. Now go do something with it. What did he do? He didn't do anything. You see, he wasn't all in because he didn't truly care about doing the master's will. You know, he says that he's afraid. I don't know. He's afraid. The master says that he's lazy. Maybe he was greedy. I don't know. But in some sense, he was not willing to lose what he had to do God's or do the master's will. You see, he wasn't truly dedicated. He wasn't truly all in. Well, if we're going to be ready for the end, if we're going to live with the end in mind, then we need to be all in. We need to be dedicated to pleasing the Lord. You know, I think of the parable of the talents where the master gives this 1-talent man possessions. He says, I'm giving you this blessing, now go do something with it. And he doesn't do anything with it. And I think, do we do that sometimes? Because God has given us so much, hasn't he? God has given us, he's given us life. He says, go do something with the life I've given you. He's given us wealth, possessions. He says, go do something with what I've given you. And for some of us, he's given us kids. He wants us to do something in that regard. But are we like the 1-talent man? Are we like this foolish servant who's too afraid to do anything with what God has given him? So he just doesn't do. He just buries it. Just doesn't do anything. You know, some people might say, you know, I would raise my children. I would bring up my children in the Lord. But I'm just too afraid to lose them. I don't want them to hate me or something. I want to be the cool parent. That's just like burying that 1 talent. God has blessed you with children. He wants you to do something. You don't do anything. Or maybe it's our possessions. Someone says, I would give more to the Lord. I would give more to the needy. But you know, I've got bills to pay. God says, I have blessed you with this. What are you going to do with it? And sometimes we act like the 1-talent man where we don't do anything. Fact of the matter is, we've got to be all in. And that means we've got to bear fruit. Let's go to the end of Matthew chapter 25 and sort of read where Scott left off. Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 31. Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 31. It says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, you welcomed me. I was naked, you clothed me. I was sick, you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty, give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, you gave me no food. I was thirsty, you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, you did not welcome me. Naked, you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, you did not visit me. And they will also answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not minister to you? Then he will answer them, saying, truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. These verses where Jesus separates the sheep from the goats is sort of the parable of the talents, but it's being acted out. And this is where the parable sort of becomes reality. And here's what I mean by that. Who gave them the food, the drink, the shelter, the clothing, the help, and the freedom? Who gave them that? God did, right? Just like the master gave the talents to his servants. God gave them the food, the drink, and all the rest. And essentially he's saying, what are you doing with it? To the righteous, well, they're actually putting it to use. But to the wicked, they're not willing to use what God had given them. It wasn't even theirs in the first place. It's what God had given them. They're not willing to use that to do his will. See, they weren't all in. They weren't really willing to sacrifice their entire lives for the Lord, for the Master. We've got to be different. If we're going to live with the end in mind, then we've got to be all in. But that's not all. If we're going to live with the end in mind, then we can't rely on time. And this is something that's evident, again, in all three of these parables. In the parable of the wise and foolish servant, the foolish servant believes he has enough time. He says, my master is going to be delayed, so I can sort of live how I want and fix it later. But the master is not delayed. We don't know when the master comes back, but the text sort of seems to say that the master came back sooner than he was expecting. See, time didn't help him. He shouldn't have relied on that time. In the parable of the bridesmaids, we see something different from the first parable. In the parable of the wise and foolish servants at the end of chapter 24, he was hoping that the master would be delayed. But in the parable of the bridesmaids, we look at 25 and verse 5. It says, as the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. So here we see something different. In the first parable, the servant was hoping the master would be delayed. But in this parable, the master actually was delayed. And isn't it interesting that extra time didn't help the foolish servants, didn't help the foolish bridesmaid. They still didn't have enough time to prepare for the master. And if we look at the parable of the talents, we see something similar. Verse 19, it says, now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. So again, unlike that first parable, here the master takes a long time. And isn't it interesting that this third servant didn't make good use of that long time? See, the time didn't help him at all. And that's, I believe, another lesson that these parables are trying to teach. We can't rely on time in helping us to prepare for the end. And here's why. First of all, we may just not have a long time. You know, we live in sort of a put it off culture, I guess I could say, a culture where we kind of like say, you know, I'll get it done. I'm going to do it, but I'm going to just do it later. I'll do it like tomorrow or something. You know, whenever I was in school, and you guys have probably seen this a little bit, but when I was in school, we would have papers due at times. You know, that's just how school is. You got to write papers. Maybe it's a 10-page paper. Maybe it's like a 20-page paper or something. And the teacher will say, well, it's due on Thursday at the end of the semester at 11:59. So you've got like 5-6 months to work on it. And really what ends up happening, and I'm pretty sure it's like a majority of the class would do this, what ends up happening is on that Thursday at around 6 o'clock, people would start writing that paper, and we'd be very busy. And then at around 11:58 or so, we would hit the submit button and send it. And that's just because, you know, we live in sort of a put-it-off culture. I'll do it. I've got 6 months to do it, but I'll do it in, you know, the last 6 hours or so. And, you know, that might be funny or whatever, but unfortunately, this is how some people treat religion as well. This is how some people treat their spiritual lives. I know I need to get right with the Lord. I'll do it. But I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it another day. And let me just say that there's a big problem with this way of thinking. This way of thinking relies on time that we might not necessarily have. It relies on time that we are not guaranteed. The Lord could come back tomorrow, like with that foolish servant in the first parable. He will come in a day that we're not expecting, at an hour that we do not know. So we might not have a long time, but even if we do have a long time, is that going to help us? Yeah, I don't know if it will, and I think that's the point of these last two parables. The first parable, the servant was hoping that he would have a long time, and in the last two parables, they actually did. But it didn't help him at all, did it? Let's go to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. In this context, Paul is describing, I guess, the way of the world. Romans chapter 1, we're going to pick up in verse 21. And David referenced this a little bit in his lesson. Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 21. It reads, "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged the natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with the women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, rootless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them." Did you guys see sort of a recurring phrase in these verses? I did. There's a couple of times where it says, "Therefore God gave them up," or "God gave them over." We see it in verse 24, verse 26, and verse 28. And there are people who have some questions about this. But the idea behind this is God is going to give you what you want. You want to be a child of God? You truly want to be a child of God? Well, God will open that door for you if you obey him. But if you want to leave the Lord, he's not going to hold you hostage. He's not going to kidnap you. God will let you leave. And what is the ultimate outcome of that? Well, the ultimate outcome is that they're blind. They can't see anymore. Verse 21 says, "They became futile in their thinking, and their hearts darkened." I think the idea behind this text is you can walk down the worldly road so long that it's very hard to come back. Doesn't mean that God won't let you back. It just means you're so far down that road that you can't even see the way back anymore because you're so blind. I look at the end of the verse 32, the end of that section, verse 32. "Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them." You see, they know that what's right, but they just don't do it. They can't see anymore. Kind of reminds me of what the psalmist says in Psalm 115. This is where Terry read from at the beginning of service. "Why should the nations say, 'Where is their God?' Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases." So the nations are saying, "Well, you don't have a God like us. We can touch our God. We have the image of our God right here. Where's yours?" And the psalmist says, "Our God is in the heavens." But then he starts talking about their gods. He says, "Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths, but do not speak, eyes, but do not see. They have ears, but do not hear, noses, but do not smell, smell. They have hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk, and they do not make a sound in their throat, and those who make them become like them. And so do all who trust in them. The idea is you worship these idols long enough, and you're going to become blind, just like the idols. And the same is true for people who are part of the world. You walk that road of worldliness long enough, and maybe you can't see the way back. And that's why I think even if we have a long time, is it going to help? See, if we're going to live with the end in mind, then we need to understand that we can't rely on time. We ultimately don't know when the Lord is going to come back. You know, at the beginning of the lesson, we talked about how people speculate when the end of the world is going to be. And people can speculate all they want. We don't know when the end of the world is going to be. And that's why we need to live with the end in mind. That's why our minds need to be oriented toward the destination. That's why we need to ultimately be ready, like God says in these parables. And that's really where I want to close tonight. Are you ready? Are you ready for when the Lord comes back? Well, if not, then why not? If we can help you with that tonight, if we can help you get ready, we can help you get ready for the Lord's return. Maybe it's that you want to come back to the Lord. Maybe you've left the Lord, you've been part of the world, but you want to come back. God wants you back, and He'll allow you back in. We'd love to help you with that. Or maybe it's that you want to become a child of God. You want to become a child of God, become one of His servants, and be under the authority of the King. Well, we'd love to help you with that also right now, as we stand and as we sing.